in the quiet corridors of ancient empires, long before history was written in books and long before kingdoms rose or fell by the sword, there existed a system concealed behind guarded walls, a system designed to shape young attendants into polished instruments of royal culture, etiquette, and courtly refinement. And this system, though often simplified in modern retellings, stretched across continents, from the palaces of China to the inner courts of the Ottoman Empire, from the ceremonial halls of Persia to the grand enclosures of the Mughal world, each region developing its own methods of selecting, training, and transforming boys who would serve not as soldiers or scribes, but as elite personal attendants positioned close to rulers, nobles, and royal families. While later writers sometimes use labels that blur the complexity of these roles, the truth is that these boys were chosen not for anything inappropriate or suggestive, but for their potential to embody a very specific blend of grace, discipline, loyalty, and cultural intelligence that royal households considered essential for the inner machinery of palace life. The process began far from the palace walls, in villages where scouts, tax officers, trusted eunuchs, or provincial officials quietly observed children during festivals, marketplaces, or seasonal gatherings, seeking not maturity, but malleability. Children old enough to learn court etiquette, yet young enough to adapt without resistance. In China, palace officials selected boys who displayed calm temperament, delicate manners, sharp memory, and the ability to remain composed in stressful environments. Their eventual roles inside the Forbidden City required them to operate with precision, silence, and emotional discipline. In the Ottoman Empire, the Devshirme system carefully identified boys from specific regions who exhibited quick intelligence, controlled demeanor, and physical symmetry, qualities that allowed trainers to mold them into dignified court pages who would serve close to the Sultan during ceremonies, feasts, and private gatherings. In Persia, cultural refinement shaped the criteria. Boys who showed musical sensitivity, poetic inclination, or natural grace and movement were often chosen because Persian courts valued art as a language of diplomacy. And in the Mughal world, where imperial culture blended Persian elegance with Indian aesthetics, young boys were assessed for their ability to learn languages, adapt to ceremonial routines, and maintain poised presence in front of royalty. Yet selection was only the beginning of a far deeper transformation, one carefully engineered by palace systems that had perfected their methods over centuries. Once brought into the palace, these boys entered training academies or inner schools overseen by senior attendants, eunuchs, or elite instructors, each responsible for shaping a different dimension of their identity. They learned how to walk without disturbing the air around them, how to bow with dignified fluidity, how to pour tea or sherbet with flawless grace, and how to present themselves with a balance of humility and refinement. They memorized court rules, ceremonial protocols, and the delicate hierarchy of royal etiquette so they would never commit an offense in the presence of nobles or foreign guests. In China, this training took place inside specialized eunuch schools, where master attendants drilled students for hours in posture, breathing, hand movements, incense preparation, script reading, and the art of interpreting the rhythm of imperial life. In the Ottoman palace, boys lived inside the Enderan system, a multi-tiered academy where they studied languages, calligraphy, music, moral discipline, and physical conditioning, Only the most refined of them would be placed inside the Sultan's inner service, where even the slightest error could carry consequences. In Persia, the training environment resembled a miniature cultural academy. Boys learned storytelling, poetry recitation, lute playing, and the philosophy of courtly conduct, because Persian courts believed that a well-cultivated attendant reflected the sophistication of the empire itself. In Mughal palaces, trainers emphasized multilingual ability, artistic sensibility, and the discipline of attending to rulers during long discussions, imperial audiences, or ceremonial rituals. Despite these differences, one universal truth connected every empire. The transformation of these boys was not physical. It was psychological. The palace separated them from their old identities, their villages, and their families, placing them in controlled environments where their new life became their only reality. Their primary task was not to entertain nor to serve blindly, but to embody elegance, stillness, and absolute dependability in the most intimate private rhythms of royal life, preparing garments, arranging chambers, fetching books, organizing personal items, managing ceremonial objects, or assisting during private audiences, all roles that required a rare combination of trustworthiness and emotional intelligence. Their proximity to rulers gave them a strange dual status, invisible to the world outside, yet indispensable to the beating heart of the empire. They moved behind curtains during meetings with generals, observed foreign diplomats during negotiations, and often became silent witnesses to moments of triumph, grief, anger, or political upheaval. Because they were young and shaped by the palace itself, rulers trusted them more than adult officials whose loyalties could shift with ambition. Yet this proximity also placed immense emotional weight on them. They had to master the art of concealing their feelings, maintaining grace, even in fear, and navigating shifting political winds without ever appearing involved. Many of them carried this psychological burden for years, balancing their identity between obedience and quiet intelligence, becoming skilled in reading human behavior long before modern psychology existed. But behind the polished surface of this system rested a deeper truth. These boys were symbols. To rulers, they represented the empire's ability to mold human character. To palace officials, they were tools of continuity. To historians, they became shadows wandering through manuscripts and paintings. And yet, if one looks closely at surviving records, diaries, travel accounts, paintings, court logs, and scattered letters, one finds hints of their inner world, subtle lines describing a boy who learned to stand still for hours during winter ceremonies, or another who memorized poems to calm his mind before entering the ruler's private chambers, or one who wrote that palace life taught him the weight of silence more than the value of words. They lived lives defined by discipline, yet edged with longing, filled with purpose, yet shaped by sacrifice, surrounded by luxury, yet deprived of freedom. Their roles were not glamorous. They were demanding, exhausting, and emotionally complex. They grew up inside walls coated with gold leaf, but they were not free to walk beyond them. They experienced the world through the measured steps of ritual and duty, through the rise and fall of kings, through the shifting moods of courts that depended on their presence, yet never truly saw them as individuals. And even after years of service, when they became fully trained attendants, their future remained uncertain. Some rose to respected administrative positions, becoming trusted advisors, chamber managers, or custodians of ceremonial archives. Some became guardians of palace treasures or overseers of rituals. Others faded quietly into lesser roles as they aged, their youth no longer needed by the palace's meticulous machine. A few found peace in retirement, granted by rulers who valued their loyalty. Others slipped into anonymity, forgotten by the very systems that once shaped them. Yet the legacy of these boys endures, not because they wrote history, but because they lived inside it, influencing rulers through quiet presence rather than loud counsel, holding secrets that shaped empires, witnessing moments that never reached chroniclers, and embodying a forgotten truth of ancient civilization, that the most delicate machinery of power was often carried not by generals or ministers, but by young attendants whose lives unfolded in the shadows, polished into symbols of refinement, discipline, and devotion, standing at the fragile intersection between innocence and responsibility, between anonymity and influence, between childhood and the overwhelming architecture of empire. In the later years of their service, as the boys who had once entered the palace wide-eyed and uncertain gradually grew into composed young attendants trained through years of discipline, ritual, and emotional endurance, their lives began to diverge in ways that revealed both the fragility and complexity of the palace systems that shaped them. For although they were molded into symbols of refinement, loyalty, and perfection, the world around them never stopped shifting, and each empire, whether Chinese, Ottoman, Persian, Mughal, or North African, carried currents of political tension that inevitably swept through the private quarters where these boys lived their lives. In China, as emperors aged and new rulers rose, the trusted attendants of one reign often found themselves dangerously exposed in the next. A young attendant who had spent years serving an emperor could suddenly become a reminder of an old political era and therefore a liability. Some were reassigned to distant administrative posts deep inside the palace bureaucracy. Some were transferred to ceremonial responsibilities far from imperial chambers, and some simply vanished from records, absorbed into the vast machinery of palace operations where individual identity dissolved into duty. In the Ottoman world, the transition of power was even more dramatic. When a sultan died, the palace underwent a complete reorganization. Attendants who had served in the inner rooms were either elevated, relocated, or quietly dismissed, depending on the preferences of the new ruler. Those who had been closest to the former sultan often carried knowledge, memories, and emotional bonds that made them both valuable and vulnerable. Some were given honorable positions within the administrative hierarchy, but others were replaced by new selections entering through the Enderan system, their years of training overshadowed by the unchanging demands of palace tradition. In Persia, where courts prided themselves on beauty and culture, the changing tastes of rulers shaped the fate of attendants more than political tides. A new Shah might prefer attendants trained in different arts, new music, new poetry, new etiquette, and thus the older attendants, even if still young by ordinary standards, found themselves gradually pushed into supporting roles, teaching newcomers the skills they once embodied. In the Mughal world, the fate of attendants depended heavily on patronage. A boy who had served a powerful noble or emperor might receive protection and opportunity long after his service period ended. But if his patron died or fell from favor, the attendant's stability evaporated with startling speed. Some became minor functionaries, others relocated to provincial courts, and a few attempted to reintegrate into civilian life, a nearly impossible task after years of isolation from the outside world. And yet, despite the differences in geography, culture, language, and politics, a single emotional thread connected all these paths. The realization that the palace had shaped these boys so deeply that they no longer fully belonged anywhere else. They had grown up inside a world where silence was a language, where posture was communication, where duty replaced childhood, and where emotions were carefully folded into rehearsed gestures. When they reached adulthood, they carried the palace within them, moving through life with the quiet precision of men who had learned to survive by observing everything and revealing nothing. But even as they matured, the palace continued to rely on them in subtle, often invisible ways. They became the memory keepers of ceremonies, the guardians of objects that had outlived kings, the interpreters of royal customs, the stabilizing hands that preserved continuity between reigns. A ruler might change, a dynasty might crumble, but an experienced attendant could guide new officials through the labyrinth of court rituals as if reciting the pulse of the palace itself. Yet beneath this surface of stability lay unspoken truths. Loneliness carried from childhood, identity shaped not by nature but by ritual, echoes of a world they had witnessed without ever truly participating in, and in rare moments, usually in the quiet hours before dawn when the palace slept, these attendants walked through the silent courtyards and reflected on lives spent inside walls that both protected and confined them. They remembered the day they were selected, the uncertainty of their first steps inside the palace, the weight of training, the demanding expectations of rulers, the shifting political storms, and the gradual erosion of the world they might have known if fate had not taken them down this path. Some felt pride in the discipline they had mastered. Some felt sorrow for the simplicity of life they had never experienced. Some felt grateful for stability compared to the hardships of their birthplaces. And some felt caught between identities, their past too distant to return to, their present too rigid to escape. And across generations, these unnamed attendants became the invisible threads stitching together the inner history of empires. They overheard the arguments of generals, witnessed the tears of rulers, carried messages no minister could be trusted with, and stood as silent anchors in moments of crisis. When foreign ambassadors visited, they ensured the palace projected power. When succession struggles emerged, they protected the rituals that preserved legitimacy. When rulers faltered under the burden of leadership, they stood nearby as calm, stabilizing presences. They did not choose power, but they stood close enough to feel its heat, its weight, and sometimes its breaking point. And though history rarely wrote their names, these boys, later men, shaped the atmosphere of palaces in ways no official record could fully capture. They embodied the emotional architecture of empire, composed yet vulnerable, present yet unseen, essential yet unacknowledged. Their lives became a testament to an ancient truth that the stability of kingdoms often rested not only on the decisions of rulers, but on the quiet endurance of those who served them with unwavering discipline. And as centuries passed, and the empires that shaped them rose, flourished, and eventually faded into dust, the memory of these boys dissolved from official chronicles, but lingered in something far more enduring. The cultural memory of palace life, the rituals preserved in paintings, the faint descriptions in travel diaries, the subtle gestures passed down through court traditions long after the original institutions vanished. Their influence lived on in the way a courtier bowed, the way a servant carried himself, the way ceremonial halls were arranged, the way rulers expected silence in certain moments, little echoes of the countless attendants who once perfected these details through years of practice. And perhaps the most profound part of their legacy is not the tasks they performed, but the emotional imprint they left behind. A reminder that behind every magnificent palace stood individuals whose lives unfolded in the shadows, whose sacrifices preserved the elegance of royal courts, and whose stories, though not written in stone, shaped the unseen foundation of civilization. And so, in the end, the question is not how these boys were selected or trained, but what their existence reveals about the nature of power itself. That empires were not sustained merely by armies or rulers, but by the quiet discipline of those who served within their walls, carrying memories no chronicle ever recorded, and leaving behind a legacy measured not in fame, but in the depth of silence they preserved, the rituals they perfected, and the invisible loyalty that allowed kingdoms to endure far longer than any single reign.